was 2 years, 106 days old. And then I haven't another memory until I was over 4. I remember them talking to me about a neighbour having died. Well, there were 5 of us and I was the oldest of 5. In those days, children were born either in a maternity home or at home. And this Lady Carlton in Portadown had left her townhouse to the community for child welfare. It became a maternity home, and that's where we were all born. The infant mortality rate was frightening in those days. And between 1913 and 1915 in Portadown, 1,000 children were born. We lived at a place called Low Mills. Low Mills is a location, not a townland. And it's a place where there was an early planter's grinding mill fed by a river called the Closet, met at Low Mills, and the townlands of Baltay, Thomasville and Kilvergan met at Low Mills. And Kilvergan is believed to have been the site for an ancient church. But we got up in the morning early. My mother got up at 6:30, and immediately she lit the fire. We got up and we did our homework in the morning. She went out and helped my father to milk. She came in and she went over our homework. And then she made the breakfast and we went to school. I remember one day I didn't want to go, and she went out to the hedge, she got a Sally Wattle, and she walked behind me the mile to school. And every time I stopped, she hit me a skate round the backside, the Sally Wattle. And when I got down near the school, there was a corner, and I begged her to leave me there, and I would go the rest myself. Well, she said, no, I've come this far, I'll go the whole way. And she brought me to the door of the school, knocked the door, master came out, she handed me over. She said, there he is. I went to school every day after that. The land was owned by landlords and then went out to tenants. The landlord let it out, and then in about 1900, Land Acts came in, and the government bought the land from the landlord and let it out to the tenants, and the tenant had to pay back an annuity over about 60 years before he actually became the owner. So we had a rent to pay every year, and my father sold an animal to pay the rent. My brother and I were kept off school, and we walked the animals 3 miles into Lurgan, through the streets of Lurgan to the Fair Green. And my brother and I minded every hole in the hedge, and my father walked behind them. And we might have stood all day in the Fair Green, and you mightn't have got a bid for them at all. And then at the end of the day, the dealer came along when he knew you'd been there all day, and when he knew you needed the money for the rent, and he offered you a bad price. And you had no alternative but to take it. The flax, the linen trade was cyclical to some extent, and there'd been a boom during the American Civil War and then a recession. And the same thing happened after the First World War. There was a boom, and my father thought he would make a fortune, but he didn't. There was a recession immediately after the war, and he was left, he sold a good big acreage of flax in April of 1920, and the world flax market collapsed in June 1920. And he was left with all this flax that he couldn't get rid of. And when I was a child in the 1930s, it was all stacked around the house, because flax is a fibre and it doesn't decay. And when the Second World War came, he was able to sell the flax that he had grown 20 years earlier. And I remember him going on the bicycle with the flax to the different scotch mills to get them to scotch it, which meant putting it through a machine to break up the fibre and to produce what was called tow. and whichever machine, whichever firm gave him the heaviest return in tow, they got the flax. And it actually went to a firm called Mills in Benburb. And then in the Second War, we grew flax. And as children, my brother and I pulled the flax by hand, and it was put in a flax hole. There were a number of them around the countryside. And when the flax was retted or broken down in the water in the flax hole, it was then taken out and spread round on the field, and to dry and tied up again. And then that's when it went to the Scotch mill. There were a number around the country, a number of flax holes around the country, so there must have been a number of other people growing flax as well. But then toward the end of the war, flax pullers were introduced as a machine. Now I never saw one of those working, but that meant the hand labour went out of it. See, the main crop in those days was called corn. It's really, the real name for it is oats. But the main crop now is barley, and there's very little oats grown. It's reseeded ground. This seed was used for reseeded ground, and it was always sold, I can remember, to a firm called Hirsch's in Lurgan. Wheat was used for thatching, and you couldn't thresh it. You had to knock the seed off it and keep the straw straight for thatching. There were still quite a number of thatched houses in the countryside, and thatched houses were warm houses, but they were damp houses because there was no spouting the thatch, and the water ran off the thatch just down round the walls, down round the foundations, and it meant that the house was damp. And then they started putting corrugated iron on top of the thatch, and they were really producing a death trap, because if a spark got out of a chimney and ignited the thatch, the house was well on fire before you ever knew. And there were quite a number of houses people burnt out in when I was a child. Maybe half a dozen of our neighbours were burnt out. Our hay shed was burned. And then the better off people would have saved their houses. And the walls were looked at, and they knocked holes in the mud wall. The houses were mostly mud wall, and they knocked holes in the mud wall and put in bigger windows, and then they put in brick round the windows. So when they got a wee bit of money, the first thing they did was to improve the houses. A house, by the way, in the olden days was built in no time at all. If people went to get married, they just put the house up. Mud walls and a bit of a roof on it, and that was it. North Armagh was the heaviest populated part of Ireland because it had a linen industry, and when a family grew up and married, they just reduced the size of the farm, built a house. So you got very closely knit family communities. I did read about a rector who described his congregation as thos'uns, them'uns, and our'uns. Uns means ones, and our'uns means our immediate relatives. And thos'uns, them'uns is other families. In every way, we had no transport, you see. We had no world vision. I'm such a localised kind of person that I think in the olden days, if I'd been in the 19th century, I would have starved. I wouldn't have had enough initiative to emigrate. But for people, we have relatives who emigrated to New Zealand from Ballinacor, to the very south of New Zealand, the far ends of the earth. They were very brave people or very desperate people, I don't know which. My father knew a man who died in 1920 who lived in Balteg, and he had never been in Portadown or Lurgan in all his life. My father was never out of Ireland. He would never have been any further than Belfast. When the flax market collapsed in 1920, he wouldn't have known. No communication whatsoever with the outside world. No telephones. It was an inward-looking world in many respects. Just talking about communication, in the old Portadown papers, which I read a lot of, on the front page you had a little space and it gave all the local telephone numbers. All the local telephone numbers in about a quarter of the front page. We had to walk half a mile to a telephone. Half a mile, and then when I got there to turn an old handle and you didn't know how to work it and couldn't half hear it either. In exceptional cases, a telegraph man came out from the post office with a telegram if some relative died in Bangor or somewhere. In the 1930s, there was an organisation called the Ulster Transport, NIRTB, Northern Ireland Railways and Transport Board or something like that. And they had buses. And they provided a bus service where the Ulster bus does now, to a timetable, but only in the main routes. We had to go a mile before we could get a bus. The rail service was quite good, but the railways in Ireland never had enough commercial business to make them really pay. In England, of course, you had the industrial coal mines and all that sort of thing. We used to go up to the railway near home and count the wagons. I can remember counting 50 or more. Sometimes they put 2 engines on them. And my father remembered going to the railway to see King Edward. He'd come to visit Ireland after his coronation. And I don't know how they got to know that he was going from Dublin to Belfast or Belfast to Dublin. And they saw the royal train go past. But the train opened up Ireland with significant uneconomic railway lines to all sorts of wee odd places, you know. The farthest place I travelled to would have been Warren Point, Belfast. Don't know whether I ever went to Portrush by train or not. I don't think I did. I remember going to Belfast for 2 shillings in the bus. But what 2 shillings would have bought in those days, I don't know. I remember during the war, my grandmother was living with us, and I was afraid, dead scared, if the Germans would come. How would we ever escape, particularly Granny? Because she couldn't walk. How would we ever get her away? And we hadn't enough bicycles to cover the house, cover the household. So we were all going to be put in a concentration camp or something. Everything was rationed. Although when you lived in the country, you had what my mother would have called a roughness of food. You had your own vegetables, you had your own milk. You certainly would not have starved. But the most important thing, sweets were rationed. And we found that rather difficult. Each person had a ration book and you had to go and the shopkeeper cut off the coupons as you bought your sweets. And the favourite sweet in those days was Danny Boy Toffee. And you could get 10 sweets for a penny. And they were made by Inglis's Bakery in Belfast. And of course they're very bad for the teeth. They were a treat that we enjoyed very much. The local shops, they would have sold biscuits and candles and things, but not the main groceries. The main grocery was sold by the grocer's shop in the 2 towns. And a man came round at the beginning of the week and he collected an order and then he delivered it at the end of the week. So there was the main grocer supplying the main grocery order. There was the local shop, and I remember about 6 of them, supplying odds and ends. And then there was the travelling man. We never knew his name. We called him by what he was. The bread man, the beef man, the herring man, that's a fish man. And there they came very, very, very frequently. Bread man was the most common of all. There was no bin man. You disposed of your own rubbish whatever way you could. And the pig man, that was another man who came by his trade. The pig man came and he killed the pigs. And the only bit of the pig that we ever ate was the liver. And the pig was hung up usually on a hay shed. I don't know where the pigs went, who bought them, I don't remember that. But I remember the big man coming. It was a terrible experience. They just killed him by hitting him in the head with a mallet. I did indicate earlier that when you lived on a farm, you wouldn't have starved. But we got a lot of porridge. We got shredded wheat, was the main thing that my mother would have bought from the grocer. We got a lot of things that were based on milk because we had milk. And there were two main items of equipment. One was a oven, which was a flat top on it, and that was used for baking because you could build a fire underneath it, and you could put a fire on the top of the oven, on the lid. That was usually turf. So my mother would have baked a lot of bread, and baked apple tarts, of course. We had a few apple trees, and she boiled some indigestible thing at Halloween. It was boiled in a pot, and there were rings put in it, and it was good luck if you got a piece with the ring in it. I don't know what the good luck meant, but there it was. That was called a Halloween pudding. I can't remember making a plum pudding now. I don't remember that. But we did get a lot. Another favourite thing was corn flour, which was a white thing, a bit like semolina. The toys at Christmas were no plastics. Plastics came in after the war and just changed society, changed toys altogether. Our toys were little things made out of like light tin, and particularly we motor cars and little engines, and you turned a key and the engine would go. And there were these people with wonderful hands, and they made little tracks, little railway tracks that these things went on. We didn't have many toys now because there wasn't all that much money around, and it was, more or less wartime, We made our own fun. We played cowboys and Indians, and we made our own swords. When we played cricket, we made our own bats. The only thing we couldn't make was a football. And the football was made up of leather panels with an inflated tube inside. And we used to go to a farmer every year and ask him for the loan of a field, and somebody would lend us a field, and we'd play there. You might have been playing for 5 minutes, and the ball went into the hedge, got punctured, and that was the football over for the day. The teacher that I had was the most exceptional teacher. He wouldn't have fitted in now at all. But he had an instinct which told him when we were receptive and when he was on song. And he would have taught us more in a week than most other people would have taught in a month. If it was a good day, we'd have gone out to the garden in the middle of the day, or gone out and played football, or gone out and played cricket. If an inspector came now and found you doing that, he'd be asking some questions. But that's the way we were taught. We went to school maybe at night, but we learned, and learned a great deal. I would have had 3 Shakespeare plays done when I left primary school. We learned songs by the dozen because he played a variety of instruments. He put me in for a scholarship. I didn't know what a scholarship was. I didn't worry about whether I passed it or didn't, because I didn't know what he was talking about. My father wasn't all that keen about signing a form to let me do it, because he wanted me to give him a bit of a hand on the farm. But my mother won the domestic struggle, and she got him to sign the form for me to do the scholarship. I'd never been put it down on my own, and going to put it down on my own worried me more than doing the examination. So there it was. I got a scholarship, and then my brother got one the next year, and that's how we got education. I had been in Allochmore for 22 years, 20 of them as principal, when a neighbour, my next door neighbour, was murdered in the Troubles. That affected me profoundly. because he would have got up in the middle of the night to do anybody a good turn. I thought, what can I do about it? And I decided there was very little I could do. I could do a little bit personally, but I wasn't going to change the world. Ballyowen School was advertised. It was felt that it would be probably the most difficult job in the Southern Education Library Board. It was right plumb in the middle of the Gawahi Road. And I decided that that was the place for me, that I really wanted to go there to see what I could do, if anything, to improve the situation. And I was appointed to Ballyowen School not because of any merit of my own, but because there were very few applicants. I was 1974. I was there until I retired 22 years later, and I received far more goodwill than I ever deserved. We live in an age of what I'd call accelerated change. When the first wireless came, we didn't have a wireless for ages. And my father used to bring us every Sunday night to hear the news, the neighbour's house. And you heard the national anthems of the Allies, and you heard all about the war. And I followed the war in great detail. But nowadays, sure, you don't even need correspondence. Any Yahoo in Timbuktu can send a message of what's happening in Timbuktu. You don't need war correspondence.